All right. So thank you everybody for joining us for our first webinar of this agricultural webinar series. My name is Brittany Scott and I work for the Clean Annapolis River Project. For those of you that don't know us, we are a charitable community-based NGO based out of Annapolis Royal, incorporated back in 1990. And our mission is to enhance the ecological health of the Annapolis River watershed for current and future generations through science, leadership, and community engagement. Just some quick housekeeping before we get going. So this webinar will be recorded and we will post it to our Facebook and YouTube channel afterwards. Please make sure that your microphones are turned off and there will be time for questions after the presentation. So today we have Alex Cadell with us. Alex is the Climate Services Specialist for the province of Nova Scotia and is working in a shared role between the Department of Environment and Climate Change and Climate Atlantic. Climate Atlantic is the new regional climate services hub for Atlantic Canada. Alex works involves supporting Nova Scotians from all sectors in accessing, understanding, and applying information about climate change to their adaptation decision-making. Alex holds a BSc in Environmental Science from the University of Guelph and a Master of Climate Change from the University of Waterloo, along with a variety of professional experience that includes downscaling climate projections for municipalities, climate adaptation planning in the forestry sector, and managing climate change projects with the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq. Today, Alex will be discussing with us impacts of climate change on Nova Scotia agriculture. And with that, I will pop the hosting over to you, Alex. So you should be good to go.
Okay, let me just get this up on screen here. Can we see that? Wonderful. Let me just get the rest of my screens in order here. There we go. Okay. Thank you, Brittany, for the welcome there. And thanks everybody for making a bit of time in your day to come listen to me talk about climate change, projections and adaptation and its relevance to Nova Scotia agriculture. Really, the purpose of why we're going over all this is to help you better understand the magnitude and timing of some of the climatic changes that we're expecting in Nova Scotia. I like this photo not only because it's cute, but also a nice reminder that the next generation of Nova Scotians working in agriculture will be facing new challenges and opportunities, and it's useful for us to start thinking about what those are. So ultimately, I hope this next hour or so helps to provide clarity on how climate change may directly affect you, your community, and the work that you're doing. Okay. So before we get started, I just want to briefly introduce Climate Atlantic, because I think that provides a bit of context for why I'm talking to you today and what angle I'm approaching this from. So Climate Atlantic is a new organization we just officially launched in kind of mid-December, and our whole goal is to facilitate access to regionally relevant climate information and support its effective use in planning and decision-making. We're a nonprofit organization, but we are funded by the federal and provincial governments. And for example, my role, I directly embedded within the Department of Nova Scotia Environment and Climate Change, so we work very closely with them, and ultimately working in collaboration with and in support of existing initiatives. We're very user-driven, trying to understand what people's needs are related to climate change, and our small mobile team steps in to help fill that. Our mandate is to deliver climate services, provide access to climate information, build local capacity, and offer training and support. So things like this webinar today are a great avenue for helping us to spread the word about what we're doing and what climate change is, and hopefully this is useful for you. So that being said, here's a quick overview of what I'd like to be talking about over the next 40 minutes or so. We'll start with a quick outline of Earth's climate system and talk about projecting future climate, just so we're all on the same page about what this whole climate change thing is and what the data I'm talking about is, where it's coming from. And we'll talk about 5 key messages or key findings that have come out of the updated projections that we're working with. Those being, it's getting warmer, precipitation patterns are changing, we're expecting more frequent and intense storms, sea levels are rising, and our oceans are changing. And we'll go through each of those and provide a bit of data and context for each of those. And then we'll wrap up with some information on adaptation in the agriculture sector to hopefully provide a bit of a positive spin on what we can start doing about this. I also just want to thank Cassandra, who's an intern with Climate Atlantic, who's joined me here today for pulling together a lot of the information in that section. So thank you. But to get us started here, let's talk about Earth's climate system. I'm sure we're all used to this idea of weather. We know that it encompasses the day-to-day changes in Earth's atmosphere, Sometimes it's hot, it's cold, wet, dry, cloudy, rainy. But really, when we're thinking about weather, it comes down to this question of, if I'm going to be outside today, what do I need to wear to be prepared? Whereas with climate, we're talking about the long-term patterns and averages of weather over periods of at least 30 years is what's recognized as what we can start calling climate rather than just a trend in weather. So that really would inform a question like, what clothes should I have in my closet to be prepared for the typical range of climate in which I live? Earth's climate system itself is driven by energy in the form of heat from the sun, and it is the uneven heating of the Earth's surface that drives this complex three-dimensional circulation of air and water that distributes heat around the globe, which is depicted in the diagram on the right there. But overall, the energy that enters the climate system is equal to the energy that leaves it. It's a system that's in relative equilibrium, unless there's some sort of change within the system. And that is where greenhouse gases come in. These are compounds that, just due to their molecular structure, are very effective at trapping heat within the atmosphere. And this includes compounds like carbon dioxide, which is probably the most prevalent and most discussed, but also methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases as well. These are compounds where their atmospheric concentrations are increasing due to human activities. I know the scale on the graph there might be a little bit small, but this is a graph of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere over the last 10,000 years. So we can see that over much of that time, the CO2 concentration has remained relatively stable between around 260, 280 parts per million, until this large spike that coincided with the onset of widespread, exponentially increasing human use of fossil fuels. So there's a couple of dates there you can see as well, just noting how quickly this is still increasing. And just as of last week, February 14th, the latest CO2 reading in the atmosphere was 420 parts per million. So overall, the trend so far has been for global emissions to continue increasing year after year. And while there are numerous international commitments to reduce GHG emissions, there are still many of those that lack a concrete plan for how those targets will be met. And while there has been some progress and there's some optimism about the direction that we're heading in, we do still have a long way to go. And I think it's important to recognize that, for example, due to the long residence time of these gases in the atmosphere, which means that once they are emitted, they tend to persist for decades, if not centuries, before they're naturally broken down or withdrawn from the cycle. Once these gases are emitted, we are dealing with the consequences for decades to come. So if we think about projecting future climate, talking about where the data I'll be talking about is coming from. As you may be aware, we use an ensemble of complex climate models to simulate the physical, chemical, and biological processes in Earth's land, atmosphere, and oceans. The results that come out of these simulations, what we call projections, help us to better understand long-term patterns and averages of the climate system. So again, a reminder that models aren't attempting to forecast conditions at a specific point in time, but rather to help us understand what the average conditions in a future period of time might be. So we're not talking about what the weather is going to be like in 2052, but what an average year in sort of the 2040 to 2070 period is going to look like. Due to computational limitations with these very complex models, we often have to further downscale the results that come out of them to be more relevant to our local area. And the results that I'll be talking about today are coming from an ensemble of 27 different climate models that have been statistically downscaled to a approximately 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer grid bounded to the borders of Nova Scotia, which is really just to say that the data is locally relevant and it's scientifically sound. It's also useful to acknowledge that there are sources of uncertainty in climate projections, both due to the chaotic nature of the climate system and human decision-making and the impacts that will have later into the century. But overall, the causes are very well understood, and we have more than enough information to act. Just a couple of words about climate scenarios before we move off of this. So scenarios are just plausible descriptions of how the future may develop and reflect the range of uncertainty in projections. Today, we'll be focusing on RCP 8.5, which is a high emission scenario. RCP just stands for Representative Concentration Pathway, and the number, in this case 8.5, denoting the change in radiative forcing in watts per square meter that level of greenhouse gases results in. The reason we're focusing on this high emission scenario is because it does most closely match the increasing trajectory of global emissions to date. However, I think it is useful at this point to note that projections are quite consistent across scenarios for at least the next several decades. I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but kind of over until around 2040, 2050 or so, the choice of scenario doesn't actually impact things all that much, and that's due to the climate system basically catching up to the emissions that have already been put into the atmosphere. So I think it's useful to recognize that at least in the near term, we've got quite a good understanding of where we're going, and we're relatively locked into that pathway. Our choices today do still absolutely have a large impact further into the century, as you can see, but at least for the near term, we kind of know where we're going. And the rate of warming that we are experiencing, and that is present included, we've already started to experience this rate of warming and we're on this trajectory, will result in some very different climate conditions by mid-century. So by 2040, 2050 or so, we can see that an average year is already well above what the historical conditions might have been, which is denoted by that gray envelope at the beginning there. And that's an issue because many of our built and natural systems are designed for and adapted to the range of historical climate conditions. And if we're departing from that, that means things are changing and we need to be prepared for them. So let's get into how the climate is changing in Nova Scotia. As I mentioned, there's 5 different kind of themes that I'll be talking about here, and we'll start with this one of it's getting warmer. So I have a big chart for you here, but I'll break down what this chart is depicting and then we'll walk through it. So this is all hopefully very digestible. On the left column, we just have a number of different indices related to climate change. I'll talk through each of those in turn in just a moment. And then we have 3 different time periods represented in those other columns there. The baseline period of 1981 through 2010 represents sort of the historical climate in Nova Scotia, what things used to be like. The 2050s column, representing 2035 to 2065, shows more or less, as I just mentioned, no matter what scenario we choose, this is the path that we're on for that period in time, and represents kind of the minimum of what we should be preparing for. The 2080s, the column on the right, 2065 through 2095, shows the trajectory that we're on if we stay on this high emissions pathway. So there's still an opportunity to not go down this road, but it's kind of what we're on track for. And I think it's at least worth including in our risk assessment purposes as a very high impact potential future that we're facing in the province. The values themselves that you see in the chart represent the medians of the multi-model ensemble that I mentioned, and they have been averaged across Nova Scotia as a whole. So the magnitude of change does vary somewhat across the province, depending on if you're in the South Shore or Cape Breton or elsewhere, but the trends overall are certainly consistent. So that being said, let's talk about how the temperature's getting warmer here. We can see that mean temperature in our baseline period was 6.6 degrees, whereas by the 2080s could increase to 11.1, an increase of 4.5 degrees Celsius. Last thing I should say here is I'll mostly just be verbally pointing out the differences between baseline and 2080s, just to not throw too many numbers out there, but the other numbers are there for you to follow along with if that's helpful. The annual hottest day that we typically experience in an average year, and again, this is just air temperature, not accounting for humidity, increasing from 29.6 degrees Celsius to 34.4. Along with that, we can see increases in the number of days that exceed certain heat thresholds, like 29 degrees Celsius, which is the typical criteria for issuing a heat warning in Nova Scotia. So on average in the baseline period, about 2 days per year would exceed that threshold. By the end of the century, we could be seeing 32 days or over a full month worth of days that would be under heat warning. Nights that exceed 18 degrees Celsius, what we call tropical nights, really warm, muggy, difficult to get to sleep. I'm sure you've experienced them. In the baseline period, we had an average of 2 per year again, and by the end of the century, 39 is what we're on track for. Looking at some of our cold temperature indices, we can see that winter is actually warming most rapidly out of all seasons. So for example, the annual coldest day that we experience in an average year, increasing from negative 21.9 degrees Celsius to negative 13.6. So you can see that the days that are below negative 15, for example, decreasing from an average of 15 to less than 1. We will rarely see those temperatures into the future, and that really does change some of the characteristics of our winter season. The increase in temperature does also drive our average winter temperature from negative 3.7 to plus 1.3. So quite, again, a different regime there if we're going from a season where the temperatures typically stay below freezing to above freezing. Some impacts there on ecology and different things as well. The number of freeze-thaw cycles that we typically experience in an average year decreasing from 44 to 35. And again, some important seasonal shifts within that as well. So we're losing many of the freeze-thaw cycles that would typically take place during the fall and spring seasons, with more freeze-thaw directly taking place in the winter season itself. If we look at the lengths of the growing season and the frost-free season, we can see increases there. Just to point out the difference between the two, if we're looking at the frost-free season, that is just the time from the last frost in spring to the first frost in fall, whereas the growing season is looking more at temperatures. I think for this study, we looked at the first time in a year where mean temperature stays above 5 degrees Celsius for 5 days in a row, and same thing for the end of the season. So for native vegetation, that might be termed their growing season, whereas for more frost-sensitive crops, you'd be looking at the frost-free season. But for frost-free season, we can see an increase from 160 to 222 days, and for growing season from 200 to 255. Also, just for the agriculture focus here, wanted to point out an increase in growing degree days. I've included the 5 degree and 10 degree thresholds here. See an increase in GDD 5 degrees by about 60% by the end of the century, and for GDD 10, an increase of about 91%. So this does absolutely open up some opportunities for producing more food or growing different crops. But I do also like to pair that with the warning that it does also introduce new risks of pests, diseases, and invasive species impacting native vegetation that may not necessarily even be able to take advantage of a longer growing season the way that we think it might. Just as another quick point associated with this, I didn't have room in my chart to include cooling degree days, but I did want to point out that the higher temperatures do dramatically increase the demand for cooling as well. So businesses and institutions that have historically not needed cooling systems may need to start looking at those to support human and animal welfare. But if we think about some of the hazards associated with warming temperatures, I just wanted to point out that we can expect increases in the frequency, severity, and duration of extreme heat events. This poses risks to public health. For example, there are notable increases in mortality rates at higher temperatures. Outdoor work and recreation become more challenging, as well as many species that aren't adapted to cope with extreme heat or infrastructure that's not designed to withstand it. The increased likelihood of hot, dry conditions also increases our risk of drought and wildfire. And some of our cold weather hazards, like extreme cold and snowstorms, will certainly be less common, but will still occur given our latitude and our climate. So sometimes those events can be more impactful when we're less prepared for them. So we can't necessarily be complacent about those either. Moving on to our second key theme here, precipitation patterns are changing. Again, a similar chart, and I'll just point out a few particular trends that I think are valuable to absorb from this. So if we look at our total annual precipitation, we can see an increase from an average of 1,315 millimeters in our baseline period to 1,456, or an increase of about 11% in total precipitation by the end of the century. However, it's useful to note that more precipitation doesn't necessarily result in more available water. When we think about the higher temperatures I was just talking about in that last slide, that also does drive up rates of evaporation and transpiration. So our actual available water in soil moisture and things like that may not change dramatically with that trend. Our precipitation types are going to be changing somewhat. If we see the changes between days with rain and days with snow, we can see an increase in rain and a decrease in snow, just denoting that as temperatures warm, more precipitation will fall as rain instead of as snow. Just as another example of that, currently in winter, we get about 60% of our total precipitation in the form of snowfall, whereas by the end of the century, about 27% would be in the form of snow, with the rest as rain. So again, quite dramatic changes to the characteristics of what we think is our kind of typical winter season. And finally, we're seeing a trend towards more intense rainfall events. So for example, you can see the number of days that exceed 20 millimeters of precipitation are our most intense precipitation events. There's a slight increase there, as well as a slight increase in our average maximum 1 day and maximum 5 day precipitation totals, which does increase our risk of flooding. And in the agricultural context as well, it does increase the risk of runoff with rains falling more intensely. That leads us nicely into our third message here, being that we're expecting more frequent and intense storms. And with this, really just highlighting that we're expecting changes to the frequency, intensity, duration, and timing of some of our most intense, most impactful storm events, particularly the tropical cyclones that kind of form in the Caribbean and in the tropics and make their way up the coast and sometimes impact Atlantic Canada. That's largely driven by warming oceans that enable tropical storms to travel further north before weakening. So looking at some numbers associated with that, we're seeing projections for increased peak wind speeds, not dramatically so, but an increase of about 3.7 to 7 kilometers an hour in those very intense tropical storm related wind speeds by 2100. Again, I think it's valuable to point out that this is specifically referring to peak wind speeds during storm events. Looking at some of our average wind speed totals, the projections are actually for a very slight decrease, but overall not a big change on that front. And with wave heights as well. We've already started seeing an increase in wave heights of about 2 centimeters per decade in the summer and 27 centimeters per decade in the winter, and driven by warming waters, less sea ice, meaning that when these storms hit, well, I guess it's more likely for larger storms to hit Nova Scotia and for them to be more impactful when they do. And as you're, I'm sure, well aware, some of the hazards associated with these storm events include things like flash flooding, high wind events, storm surge, coastal erosion, and landslides. Moving on to our fourth key message, being that sea levels are rising. I always like to just pause on this photo for a moment. This was taken during a recent storm surge event in Liverpool, Nova Scotia. And I just wanted to pass along one quote that's really stuck with me, being that today's storm surge is really just tomorrow's high tide. And if we look at the magnitude of some of the storm surge events that we've experienced recently and the magnitude of sea level rise that we're expecting, we see that that's relatively close to what we're looking at in the future. And if we think about really impactful coastal inundation like events like this occurring twice a day at high tide rather than just once every 20 or 30 years when a large storm hits, and we start to wrap our heads around the scale of the problem facing a lot of our coastal infrastructure and coastal communities. But to get into some more specifics around sea level rise, I just wanted to point out that when I'm talking about sea level rise in this presentation, I'm referring to relative sea level rise. So that includes a multitude of different factors, including thermal expansion of the oceans due to warming, impacts of just rising sea levels due to melting land ice. It includes vertical land motion. If you weren't aware, Nova Scotia is slowly subsiding, which is related to the last glaciation that we had, as well as changes in absolute sea surface elevation due to the breakdown of some of our ocean currents and more water kind of pooling up against our coasts. So all of those factors combined are really what I'm referring to here. And with that in mind, sea levels around Nova Scotia are expected to rise by about 68 to 100 centimeters by 2100. And again, this is looking at the mean output from the climate models I was mentioning earlier. For anyone doing any sort of very risk-sensitive coastal planning, you may want to instead look at maximum projections or something like that. And if that's of interest, please let me know. I can certainly refer you in that direction. But for the 68 to 100 centimeter mean sea level rise that I'm talking about here, that's representing a range of regional variation. So we can see that, again, the legend is probably too small to read there, but the greener colors are more towards the 68 centimeters, with the redder colors more towards 100. So we can see that we're expecting the highest increases in relative sea level rise around Cape Breton and secondarily around Halifax. Also really wanted to highlight that this estimate does not include potential instability in the Antarctic ice sheet, which could add an additional 70 centimeters or so by 2100 on top of these projections. At this point in time, that is being looked at as quite a low likelihood event, but it would be obviously very impactful, and it's something that other jurisdictions are starting to include in their planning. For example, New Brunswick did include that Antarctic ice sheet 70 centimeter instability in their flood mapping work that they've done recently for their coastal flooding. Also wanted to highlight that actual water levels experienced will still be influenced by things like storm surge. We've experienced surges of up to about 1.6 meters on the coast of our province in recent years, as well as high tides and coastal geomorphology. So when we're thinking about sea level rise, it's not just that meter. It's thinking about what would happen if a large storm event hit at high tide under that sea level rise scenario, and what are the actual water levels we'd be experiencing there, and what's at risk in that case. Again, just to highlight some of the hazards associated with sea level rise, coastal flooding and storm surge are, I think, the obvious ones for a coastal province like Nova Scotia, but also highlighting things like saltwater intrusion. As sea levels rise, that impacts the availability of fresh water at coastal wells, for example. That's kind of interface gets pushed back, meaning that those wells would be drawing salt water instead of fresh water in some locations, and could be something to look at, particularly if your agricultural property is in somewhat of a coastal area. And certainly impacts on coastal ecology as well, particularly some of our sensitive ecosystems like dunes or salt marshes that may not necessarily be able to keep pace with this rate of sea level rise, particularly where they're already constrained on the back end and don't have room to expand, which is the case for many. Our fifth key message here is that oceans are changing. And again, I just wanted to highlight this one a little bit more briefly, but in case there's any interest in aquaculture or something like that, highlighting some of the conditions and hazards associated with our changing oceans. So we've already been seeing things like increased ocean temperatures, both at the surface and in deep water, which has consequences for physical oceanic processes, habitats, and species. And we're seeing marine heat waves becoming longer and more frequent. For ocean acidification, we're seeing an increase there, which can corrode mollusk, crustaceans, and corals, as well as diminish the productivity of ocean waters. It also can lead to an increased likelihood of algal blooms with the potential to harm or kill fish. And finally, we're seeing decreased marine oxygen levels related to higher ocean temperatures, among other factors, which can reduce species growth, reproduction, distribution, and survivorship, as well as can lead to a decline in important habitats like eelgrass beds that provide habitat for many of our commercially and recreationally important fish species. So just to wrap up this piece around climate projections, I wanted to include this slide that I've shamelessly stolen from one of my colleagues in the Nova Scotia Department of Agriculture, just because I think it does a really good job of highlighting the diversity of impacts that climate change will have on the agriculture sector specifically. Things like impacts on winter kill from warmer winters, potential for forage production changing, increasing growing season allowing for a greater range of grapes or tree fruits to be produced in our province, animal diseases and their spread being influenced by climatic conditions, increased production costs related to increased energy demand for that cooling that I mentioned earlier, warmer and wetter conditions tending to favor a more diverse pest population, excess rainfall that could delay or at least influence planting and harvest of different crops, hotter, drier summers, increasing requirements for irrigation or livestock watering, impacts on soil health and water wells, early and late frost damage could impact productivity, and flooding can certainly have the potential to impact agriculture as well. So I hope many of these things were already coming to mind as I was going through the section there, but perhaps there's some new thoughts here that you hadn't yet considered, and yeah, we can move forward with that. So this will wrap up the kind of first section here on climate projections, but just to pass along or wrap these thoughts up with a few additional thoughts. I know that was a lot of information to cover, and certainly the webinar recording will be available and we can share slides and all of those things. But if you're walking away with any new pieces of information from this session, I think these are the useful messages to know about how our climate in Nova Scotia is changing. So again, it's getting warmer, precipitation patterns are changing, we're expecting more frequent and intense storms, our sea levels are rising, and our oceans are changing. So I hope that by going through all of this, we've helped to start highlighting how the changing climate will impact infrastructure, ecosystems, public health, and ultimately ways of life in Nova Scotia, underscoring why mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions will be crucial to avoid some of those most severe impacts I was talking about, as well as why adaptation will be necessary to adjust to the changing climate. And that piece on adaptation is exactly where we're going next. Finally, just a reminder that this section was just an overview of climatic trends in Nova Scotia. There's lots of additional information available for different parameters or different geographic regions, time periods, and scenarios. If any of that would be useful for your own planning purposes, please reach out. That's exactly what Climate Atlantic is here to help assist you with. But for the rest of our time here, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about what we can do about this. So we'll talk, now that we know about the climate projections for Nova Scotia, how can we adapt? So we'll talk a little bit about adaptation itself. We'll talk about soil and water management and why they're critical for farm resilience, some additional strategies for on-farm and off-farm techniques, and highlight some of the resources that are available to help you adapt. So first, before we get too far down that road, I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page about what I mean when I'm talking about adaptation and resilience. So climate adaptation is just the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects in order to moderate harm or exploit beneficial opportunities, where resilience is the capacity for different systems to cope with a hazardous event, respond or reorganize in ways that maintain their essential function, identity, and structure. So these are definitions from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But I think it is also useful to note that these are not new concepts, adaptation and resilience. We're just applying them to climate change in this case. Agriculture in Canada has always contended with climate variability, and while agriculture is certainly quite sensitive to climate, the sector has also developed many mechanisms to enhance resilience here. So we're certainly not starting from zero. But to get into some specifics here, there's a few things I wanted to highlight about soil management in terms of adaptation strategies. So first, increasing carbon and organic matter in your soil will improve resilience to weather events, such as intense rain by increasing drainage or drought by increasing water holding capacity. This can lessen the impact of these weather events on your crops. Second, you can increase soil organic matter by building topsoil. And a lot of this goes back to making sure that the soil is living, which means that things need to be living on the soil for things to be living in the soil. Third, reduced tilling or no-till methods help to preserve the soil's natural structure, making the soil more resistant to erosion and the negative effects of heavy field equipment. This also helps you build soil organic matter. Cover crops increase soil organic matter by having living matter on and in the soil. As discussed earlier, some of the projected rain patterns for Nova Scotia can make agricultural soil susceptible to erosion, particularly in periods where the soil might otherwise be bare. So using cover crops can help to address this, and there is ongoing research locally to find best practices for incorporating cover crops into our cropping systems. And fifth, rotating crops on the same plot of land will improve soil health, optimize nutrients in the soil, and combat pest and weed pressure. A simple rotation might involve 2 or 3 crops, and complex rotations might incorporate a dozen or more. You need a plan of what crops to grow. For example, including perennials in rotation can make a big difference in soil organic matter. But really the take-home message from this slide is for soil management, it's just really important not to leave your soil bare. Switching gears to water management. First, it's important to know the ins and outs of your water supply, including where it's going. Make sure that your irrigation system is tight and does not waste water, which will in turn save you water and ultimately save you money. And as climate changes, prepare to change your plan as well. Second, the inclusion of riparian zones can help to mitigate against floodwaters by slowing the movement of water and increasing infiltration into the ground. Third, you may want to explore multiple options for storing water on your farm, such as constructed or existing wetland management, harvesting rainwater, utilizing mulches, or exploring drought-tolerant crops. And fourth, drainage saves crops from being flooded out, preventing economic loss. There are many types of drainage infrastructure, such as ditches, tile drainage, flow control structures, or culverts. Make sure that they are regularly assessed and cleared of obstructions. And for ditches, you could even consider widening them to cope with greater rainfall events. And from the last slide, we also know that increasing soil organic matter will increase the ground's ability to absorb water. Some additional on-farm and off-farm adaptation strategies that we thought were worth highlighting. First, using your carbon-based waste effectively by utilizing compost and manures as soil amendments. These are materials that are rich in organic matter and carbon. Second, using your nutrients conservatively. Don't be overly optimistic and assume that next year is going to be that perfect year. There's no need to add more nutrient inputs than you need to. Excess nutrients is poor economics and also has poor environmental impacts. Third, being resilient to year-to-year variability, which includes managing farm financials for purchasing resources to deal with an emerging pest, for example. Fourth, knowing and understanding how your local area will be impacted by climate change. And gosh, isn't attending a webinar like this a fantastic place to start with? So I commend you all for taking some time to adapt in your own way. But in addition to that, it can also be really useful to communicate with your neighbors and potentially work together or share resources about how each of you are dealing with climate change. You know, there's a social element to resilience there. And fifth, also acknowledging that farmers are consumers of many different types of resources. And as a responsible consumer, you need to be thinking about the production system that your resources have been produced in and what its relationship is to the environment. So you can ultimately make purchasing decisions that reflect your own values. Finally, just wanted to highlight the relationship between climate adaptation and biodiversity conservation, just because there are so many co-benefits between pursuing both strategies. First, one impact of climate change is likely to be new pests and increased pressure from existing pests, as a warming climate helps spread and overwinter survival. So having strong soil food webs with diverse soil organisms can help to decrease the chances of pest outbreaks by keeping populations in check. So make sure that you're building soil organic matter again. Incorporation of cover crops or otherwise increasing diversity in crop rotations can also increase biodiversity in soil organisms and insects through increasing and diversifying the food sources that they have available. Second, riparian zones provide habitat for biodiversity and filter agricultural runoff, which reduces water pollution. A sufficient riparian zone can slow water from heavy rainfall events, which prevents erosion of riverbanks, again, helping to protect riparian and aquatic habitat. Third, of course, proper chemical management, such as for things like pesticides, and where there's interest in doing so, pursuing low or no chemical inputs or organic farming, which will reduce the number of chemicals entering the environment. And fourth, having biological diversity within your farm will help you recover from unpredictable events, increase beneficial insects such as pollinators, and ultimately improve the economic resilience of the property as well. So finally, I just wanted to highlight a few of the resources that are available to get you started on this journey if these are of use. So just to highlight a few, there's the 4R strategy from Fertilizer Canada, which stands for right source at the right time, the right rate, and the right place to help minimize environmental impacts related to agriculture and maximizing economic benefits for farmers. There's the Living Labs project for the Atlantic, which has lots of useful information on their website. And Brittany was just telling me earlier about some more recent work that's hopefully taking place on that front. Crop insurance providers tend to have quite reliable climate data, and they base their rates on that and can be used as a useful resource. There's the Farmers for Climate Solutions group. Many municipalities have created or are updating climate plans, which may explore impact and adaptation strategies for the agriculture sector in your region more specifically. And certainly there's a lot of work taking place at the provincial level as well. But ultimately, if you're not quite sure where to start in navigating this network of different players in industry, government, NGOs, and academia about how climate change is impacting agriculture, please reach out to Climate Atlantic. We can help provide some information and connect you to information on climate change and adaptation. So that's what we're here for. Please don't hesitate to ask. So with that, I think I've left plenty of time for questions, which is great. My contact information is on the slide here, so I'll just leave this up for another moment or so while I finish talking. If anyone wants to copy that down, and you can certainly find this on the Climate Atlantic website as well. But overall, I hope this was informative. I hope it's ultimately useful for the work that you're doing. And I just wanted to say, Walalio, or thank you for taking some time on a Tuesday afternoon to listen to what I had to say. Thanks.
All right, so I'm just going to take back the screen. All right, so we do have time for questions. So you can either type your question into the chat and I can read it out, or there's the option to raise your virtual hand to ask a question. So you might see on the bottom of your screen a reactions button with a little smiley face, and there should be the option there to raise your hand. Then I can call on you and you can just say your question. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to go ahead. I had one question to start, Alex, actually. You mentioned that Nova Scotia is subsiding. Does that mean like it's sinking right now?
Yes, yeah. So basically, it's related to the last glaciation, like I mentioned. So we had a giant mass of ice in the center of our continent, which, as you might imagine, is incredibly heavy. So what that resulted in is basically pushing down the center of our continental plates and pushing up the edges, which had less ice on them. So now that that ice has disappeared for the last 10 to 12,000 years or so, the continent has been slowly moving back to the position it was originally in. So the center of our continent is slowly increasing or slowly rising, whereas the edges are going back to where they were. So Nova Scotia is subsiding at a rate of, I think, about 10 centimeters per century, something like that.
And Brian, I think I saw that you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Brittany. Alex, a lot of information there, and I have a lot of questions, but I'll just start with one. Can you explain if the modeling, or can it get into the idea of microclimates? What's happening on certain microclimates? And is that built into the model, or is that kind of where we're going to go in the next iterations? And I'm thinking areas like Perot River with the significant impact of the Minas Basin and what the tides does there. Obviously the valley with the North and South Mountain, and, even Windsor, and, with the basin on one side and basically a horseshoe of higher ground around it. Can we start looking at those areas and getting a little more detailed?
Yeah, great question, Brian. So really the kind of state of the science right now is that for the kind of global models that I was mentioning, those often have spatial resolutions of about 100 kilometers or so per for horizontal resolution, which is too large to capture a lot of the spatial variation on smaller scales that you were just mentioning there. However, basically all of the results that I was talking about here and information is available for more localized scales. And the way that that's accomplished is through downscaling that global data. There's a couple of different ways to do that using different modeling approaches, or typically what's done is using statistical methods. So looking at, it's basically when the models are run, sorry, I'm stepping back a moment here, but they don't start in the present day, they start back in 1950 or so, which gives us quite a long record of being able to compare what the model is saying, what the model thinks happened versus what we actually observed on the ground at different weather stations. And by looking at the difference in those relationships, we can interpret when the climate model tells us one thing, we have a better idea of what's happening at a more local level. So the data I was talking about today and what's available through different portals now is statistically downscaled and interpolated data on a grid with about 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer resolution. So that would be fine scale enough to capture things like higher ground in certain areas or the impacts of smaller bodies of water. It's not going to tell you exactly what's happening at a certain property, for example, but it can get quite close. So yeah, that information does exist and is available to you if you're doing planning in a certain area. And if you have more questions, I'd be happy to address those as well. I wanted to leave a lot of time for this because I know this is possibly a bit of a different topic for folks.
Yeah, Brian, if you had a second question that you wanted to add on to that, I'm monitoring the chat right now. Nothing's come up yet, so you're still free if you want.
No, I guess I'll delve into that one a little bit more later, some other time with you, Alex. Because one, I guess I wanted to just kind of address, and again, it's the timing of the modeling. Precipitation is changing, storms are changing. Can we say how much of that change is going to happen during the growing season? Or is it still, annually, this is what's going to happen?
Yes, again, great question. And again, just due to sort of time limitations here, I was focusing more on annual data, but we do certainly have seasonal as well. And for some cases, monthly, actually in most cases, we have monthly data. And that's again, across a wide variety of different indices. So yes, if you're curious about specifics about how precipitation is changing in June, for example, or whatever else from there, information is available to help make those choices. Great question.
We have a question on the chat. It says, is it possible that the models for sea level increasing could be undervalued as the new data is provided?
Certainly a possibility. Sea levels are one of the parameters that can be resolved with a reasonable degree of confidence in the models. Really, the uncertainty there comes from how our climate system is responding and what humans are doing. So for example, I talked about the long residence time of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, for example, and it's difficult to say what sea level rise or what sea levels will be doing 50, 100 years in the future without that full understanding of what the greenhouse gas emissions in the interim will be. So that's where a lot of that uncertainty comes from. So absolutely, as things change, as new emissions data comes available year over year, the IPCC does regular assessments as well. So just middle of last year, they released their 6th assessment report on climate change. A lot of that information is slowly becoming available in a downscaled format, and we'll be updating these numbers here as that information becomes slightly more accessible. So positive feedback loops are another major source of uncertainty here. So if that's a bit of a new concept, when we think about things like when sunlight is interacting with Earth's surface, a certain amount of it is reflected. And from our own experience, when it's snowy outside, we know that those days are often very bright because snow reflects light really well. As temperatures get warmer around the globe and we see less snow and ice, that means that more heat is actually absorbed by the Earth's surface, and that can actually accelerate climate change. So mechanisms like that, and there are others associated with it, we think we know what direction they're headed in, but it's kind of pushing our climate state into a region it hasn't been, or where we don't have observations to really fully understand the sensitivities there. So as more information becomes available, absolutely those projections continue to be updated. And as I mentioned, if you're doing any kind of particularly sensitive work on or around a coastline, it's important to not just look at the mean projections that I was mentioning there, but also to look at the maximum to think about whether you should be including that 70 centimeters from Antarctic ice sheet instability, and just having a better understanding of what the risks are over the time period that you're curious about. But great question, David.
Are there any hands or anything that I missed along the way? I'm doing my best to like keep track of it all, but I might have missed somebody also. So feel free to also just call out if you have a question. Brian, I see you raised your hand again.
Yes, sir, I'm loving this. Alex, a little not confused. Can you kind of explain the relationship between pesticide use and climate change? You know, as a mitigation strategy or an adaptation strategy, you suggested reduce pesticide use. I'm just, you know, if you're looking at that as a grower, I kind of don't see how that's going to connect.
Yeah, good question. I don't believe that was directly referring to climate change, but I might actually ask Cassandra if you're there. So Cassandra was my colleague that I mentioned, helped pull some of that specific information together. Do you want to just highlight where exactly that piece was coming from, Cassandra?
Hi, yeah, I got the information for the adaptation portion of the presentation from the Climate Atlantic Advisory Committee, some of the agriculture experts on there, as well as other ones in Nova Scotia sector, including specialists from the Federation of Agriculture, but I need to kind of review that information, but I can send you a contact for that if you would like.
If you have something, yeah, I'd appreciate it. I just, my head doesn't really reconcile that. You know, we say there's going to be more pests or could be more pest pressure, but then we say reducing pesticide use is a way to adapt. It's going to be a hard sell.
Sorry, jump in if I'm wrong here, Cassandra, but I think my impression was that would relate to sort of the health of the soil microorganism community, and just making sure that that is a healthy community, because that will also help to fight pests in a slightly different way than pesticides directly. But go ahead, Cassandra.
Exactly. No, yeah. So when we talked about, you know, increasing biodiversity and increasing adaptation, how those two help each other, you know, pesticide use affects biodiversity. So if we, increase biodiversity, pesticides kind of conflicts with that.
Yeah, I guess I prefer the term pesticide use may influence biodiversity.
Right, and that's where I would love to connect you with those experts in that field and where exactly I got that information from.
Cassandra, thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure it comes down to responsible pest management more than anything else.
That was a great question, Brian. And then I also see Rosalie in the chat. She says she would also like that information on pesticides linked with climate change.
Any other burning questions? Was this new? Was this useful? Did you find it interesting?
David says he's thinking some pests will increase and some will decrease with climate change.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, we've certainly seen examples from different sectors across the country that, you know, pest life cycles can increase or decrease, or some may be outcompeted or have to contend with different aspect or different organisms that they might not otherwise have had to. So pest regimes changing is probably the safest thing to say there.
We kind of do that every year anyways, and from field to field too. So yeah, and I think that's, again, just an important point to underscore here, is that the idea of adapting or being resilient is certainly not new in agriculture. It's just a new set of factors with climate change that we're trying to prepare for and just include in our decision making.
Were there any other questions? Well, we have Alex here and Cassandra. If not, before we wrap up, I just wanted to plug our next webinar, which will be done by our very own Katie McLean here at CARP. She has been working on a biodiversity and habitat tool for agricultural lands. So this has been done in conjunction with the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association. So it's been a long time in the making, this tool, and it's a tool that producers can go online and self-fill out to learn about the habitats on their agricultural lands. This will be on March 10th from 1 to 2. And I'm just going to leave this slide here so you have Alex's contact and also my contact if you have any following questions afterwards. But thank you so much, Alex and Cassandra, for all your guys' work that you put into developing this webinar for us. And thank you for all the great information you shared.
Thanks so much for inviting us to come talk with folks here, and hopefully the recording and everything can continue to be shared. And if we can be of any assistance at all related to climate change, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.